Ladies and gentlemen, may we introduce you to Patrick.
Hello, Patrick. He can't hear you. He's dead.
160 pounds of limp meat hanging off a comatose brain. Can you imagine anything less aware than that?
What I realised when I got into the film industry, I guess frankly learned a lesson with Phantasm, was that there was a big, wide, wonderful world outside Australia. And the films that I had always liked personally were classic American cinema. And that led me to think about the stories that classic American cinema told, and led me to think about why those films were so successful all over the world. And I guess one of the things that immediately became apparent to me was that they were broadly universal in their story, in their texture, in their theme. And so I understood at the time that I moved from the Phantasms into Patrick in 1978, that there were other people who were making films that were going to tell the history of Australia. I understood that there was a place for that in the potential repertory that the new Australian cinema was going to need to build up. But I felt very, very strongly that in the main, these were not films that were going to engage, broadly speaking, with the cinema-going audience that I knew and felt part of when I was watching movies. And so I decided to take a different track. And that track was to say, look, unless you were going to subscribe to the view that forever Australian cinema was going to be a virtual total creature of subsidy, you had to find a way to engage with the rest of the world. So that's where the notion of universality kicked in. That's where the notion of genre kicked in. Because, you know, genre is a child of universality, and the language of genre is a language that people understand all over the world, regardless of whether English is their first language or their second, or no language at all. Those rules are embedded in people who go to the cinema in all countries. I elected to swim initially in the horror thriller area because that was a subgenre that I especially liked. It was fortunate that Richard Franklin was able to introduce me to Patrick. I got it from the get-go and resolved to finance it.
Patrick?
Richard, like me, was a tremendous fan of Hitchcock. Richard had developed, through his time in California at school, a relationship with Hitchcock, and I guess the initial connection was getting Hitchcock to come down to the school one night to the class and present a Psycho and speak subsequently about Psycho. And so his exposure and his belief in Hitchcock, I think, came forth in a number of ways. First of all, he saw Hitchcock as a consummate storyteller. Second of all, he really did believe in the notion of the film being made in pre-production, and once you actually started filming, in a sense, the film was done. I mean, Richard was meticulous in pre-production, he was a meticulous storyboarder, he introduced effectively the notion of storyboarding into Australia, and of course he got that from Hitchcock. He also was very, very aware of the role that sound and music played in Hitchcock's movies. And there was no question that it was a serendipitous, fortuitous pairing of Brian May and Richard on Patrick, because Brian was the sort of composer who was both appropriately in awe of Bernard Herrmann, but was also capable of taking some of Herrmann's ideas and reutilising them, probably in a more melodic way than Herrmann would necessarily have done. So there was the music and the sound component that Richard very much embraced from Hitchcock. Because he was so familiar with Hitchcock's pictures, he would often ask himself, how would Hitchcock have shot this scene? How would have Hitchcock lit this scene? Sometimes I think he would come up with storyboard shots that were tricky and complicated in a way to sort of try and think his way through some of those shots in the way Hitchcock would have done. was a great believer in the moving camera, but not in a sort of elaborate sense of a Preminger or a Max Opals, but in the sense that he felt that the camera should be of the action but not comment on the action. Richard's borrowings from Hitchcock are, say, in my opinion, rather more oblique than, say, De Palma, for example, who tends to throw his arms around Hitchcock's technique, whereas Richard sort of comes in and inhabits it in a ghost-like fashion rather than in a full-on embrace.
What are you doing?
The film's littered with loving references, of course. Whether it's the title treatment of the movie, the title of the movie. We worked long and hard to find that hospital clinic in South Yarra. I like to think that in the same way Spielberg stole from Hitchcock for a couple of the sequences in Jaws, Richard stole from Hitchcock for the Bruce Barry in the pool sequence. There are frankly too many scenes to reference. I think the staircase reminds me very much of Mandalay and Rebecca. The axe sequence, perhaps. I see a little torn curtain there. We felt that there was a sort of an Anglo component to Patrick in terms of the story, the smell, the look. It wasn't the Frankenstein lab approach. It was more the old dark house approach. And certainly, if you were trying to find the Hitchcockian references in Patrick, you would have tended to go back to Hitchcock's British period as opposed to his, subsequent period in the United States.
Mrs. Jacquard, Dr. Roger.
When we cast Helpman, we were frankly looking for somebody who was scary, had a screen presence, could move elegantly and gracefully, could carry off a sequence like the frog-eating sequence with the gravitas that maintained the audience's revulsion and fear rather than reduce them to any sort of hysteria or ridicule.
He made me. He did it.
To him, a prop was a prop, whether it was a frog or a needle the size of a 303. He was an absolute trooper, and I'm trying to think of how old he would have been when we shot Patrick, but he must have been well into his 60s. I mean, he was in significant pain in a number of those sequences, having done some bad damage to his back. Refused to not turn up, I think took half a day off or one day off. Don't worry, darling, I'll be back. Richard, I'll be with you tomorrow, old boy. Susan Ben Halligan came to mind because Bouquet of Barbed Wire, which was a very hot and controversial and provocative TV show of the time, had attracted her to us. And she'd been in Land Time Forgot, which American International had bought for the US and were giving a big push on it. And she was affordable, she was blonde. You know, she fitted a number of criteria that Richard and I were looking for.
It's because of Patrick, isn't it? It's because I know too much.
One of the things that appeals to me about her performance is she's, in a sense, the least mannered of anybody in the picture. And yet, in a way, you would have expected her, coming from British theatre and British television, to be the most mannered.
You think I'm a slut? Why? Because I've been unfaithful? Because I won't belong to you? And
I'm not sure whether that was fish out of water or whether that was Richard was able to get that performance out of her. But given that everybody from Bobby Helpman across the board do tend to sort of push the Hitchcock melodrama.
Doctor, it's Patrick. You know it's him, don't you?
She played a very different type of performance, which ultimately worked out well because, again, she was like, to some degree, the deer in Patrick's headlights for a chunk of the picture.
Why are you doing this? What do you want?
Most of the crew that were working in Australian films at that point had, by and large, come from television. And on a film like Patrick, they were confronted with a number of things that they had to contend with. The first thing was that it was a very tight and fast shoot, and there wasn't any capacity to slow up, mess around, engage in sort of on-set banter, chat, etc., etc. Some of the crew, who were used to a sort of a slightly more relaxed environment, a sort of a more collegiate environment, were a little off-put by what they saw as Richard's a sort of authoritarian approach to direction, some of which he would have got from Hitchcock, some of which he probably would have got from the notion of just, he felt that it was important to have the chair on the set, which was a completely alien concept to Australian sense. In fact, I don't think there were even director's chairs available in Australia at that point. I think we had to go out and get you know, a conventional pool chair and have it re-equipped to Richard's specifications.
Quiet, thank you. Rehearsal and action.
You typed this, didn't you? Didn't you?
So there was the way in which he interacted with the crew.
What happened? Conrad? Right, once again.
And then I suppose there was also, the lighting particularly was very important. Don McAlpine, who's a fantastic director of photography, but was, you know, somewhat of an old school director of photography, and old school in the Australian sense of old school. And certainly in the initial few days, there were a number of sort of back and forths between Don McAlpine and Richard. You know, whether lighting was meant to be explainable in terms of the confines of the set, the geography of the set and the positioning of the set, or whether it was not. A lot of people reference Hitchcock to Fritz Lang and that the German expressionistic look. And I guess the expressionists took the view that the lighting had, in a sense, nothing to do with the practical functions of the set, but it was all about commenting on and reflecting on the characters and the moral point of view and the upcoming actions of the characters in a particular scene, or in the case of the movie. So that was a bit of a duking it out between Richard and Don. And it may well be why Richard didn't work with Don again, and you know, moved on to working with Vince Montan, who had worked with him, of course, on Phantasm and on Eskimo Nell, and was more prepared to get himself in sync with Richard's tastes and attitudes from early on in the process. Every successful horror film, thriller, needs to have 2 or 3 jump moments in the film that an audience remembers, responds to, and don't respond to individually, but respond as a sort of a communal group. That the energy of these jump moments ripple through the cinema like a rolling wave of electricity, and bang. It's certainly important, and that you have one of those scenes quite early in the process. You have one of those scenes somewhere in the middle of the movie. And for absolutely for sure, you want to have one of those scenes very, very, very late in the piece. Sometimes so late in the piece that the audience think that the movie is over. I mean, whether it's Friday the 13th or Carrie, there were a number of movies that came out around that same time that we did with Patrick that had that last moment that gets the audience yabbering, talking, and you know, just out of their heads as they roll out of the cinema.
Come on, lovely. I'll take you home.
If ever there was a movie where you could have taken the view that we should have taken an insurance policy out on the audience in case somebody had a heart attack, that would have been that movie. Now, to my knowledge, and no one's reported to me that anybody did have a heart attack arising out of that movie, but boy, would it have been great if they had.
Your frogs have arrived, Doctor.
Good. Good. Put them down. See that?
Sir?
She doesn't like coming in here.
Patrick, Mad Max and Cars That Ate Paris were amazingly today dubbed into American for their US release.
Let me get this straight, will you, Mrs. Jacquard? Are you suggesting that she was trying to kill the person in room 15?
I'm saying that there is a possibility, yes.
Why?
Well, that's a hard question to answer, but there is someone who can explain it better than I, and I think you should see him.
It's particularly bizarre with Patrick, where we tried to make the accents as international as possible.
What are you talking about?
I'm talking about last night, Ed, unless you were too drunk to remember.
Too drunk to remember what?
Honest to God, Ed, I'm really disappointed in you.
Kathy, love, I don't know what you're talking about.
My view was that if that made the film more accessible to a mainstream audience, even though I couldn't understand it, it was worth doing. And, you know, Richard, a little more reluctantly than I, embraced it as well.
I think the film's going to be an enormous success, not only in Australia, but overseas. And I think that's important for the Australian film industry. which I think you're doing such fantastic films here. You make the British film industry look really very silly at the moment.
One of the great things about Patrick was its incredible success outside Australia. Firstly at the distributor level and then at the public level in every foreign country. There wasn't a territory on our chart, and there's about 76 territories in the world where Patrick wasn't sold, and in almost every territory it sold for figures that at that point of time had not been previously achieved by an Australian film. In the United States, it had the widest release of any Australian film at that point of time. In most of the foreign territories, it's never been out of release. To this day, it's the 62nd highest grossing non-American English language picture released in Italy. It spawned an unauthorised sequel, Patrick Viva Ancora. It wasn't a success in Australia initially. I mean, like all genre films, it did okay. And ultimately, 25 years down track, I guess it's probably now recouped itself out of Australia through seminal and repetitive free and pay television screenings and various VHS and DVD releases. But outside Australia, it was absolutely a phenomenal success, and it played and it played and it played. Because the film was such a big success, one of the ideas that we had at the time, obviously I wanted to work with Richard again, I wanted to work with Everett again, and it seemed like it made sense to endeavour to make at the time, make a sequel. Richard and Everett put together the notion of a sequel to Patrick called The Man Who Wasn't There. Unfortunately, we never actually got to make that movie. And part of the reason I think for that was that I moved on so quickly to Snapshot and then Thirst. Because of the success of Patrick, Richard was offered and snapped up the opportunity to direct Road Games, and Richard and I never got to work again after that. Got close on a couple of occasions, but sadly it didn't happen.
Patrick, a chilling investigation beyond medicine, beyond science, beyond the 5 known senses.
It's as topical and as frightening today as it was when we first screened it at the AFI Awards in Perth 30 years ago.